couple of years ago, my wife Jill and I were on our way back here from visiting some missionary friends in China, and we stopped by Vietnam on the way back and spent a couple of days in the city of Hanoi, which was an amazing experience. It's a beautiful city, lots to see and do there. And one of the neat things about Hanoi is the street food culture. There are all sorts of food trucks and food vendors on the streets and sidewalks selling delicious food very inexpensively. One thing that was a little bit surprising to me, though, was that all of these vendors had sort of toddler-sized chairs and sort of preschool-sized tables at which to eat at these street vendors. And I didn't understand why until I sat in one and we had a meal. I think we had pho or something else delicious, and then it came time to get up from a chair about this high after we'd been walking probably 11 miles through the city that day. Came time to get up, and it was like, Jill, I'll have another pho, please. We understood instantly. So if you're in the food industry, I recommend get really small, low chairs. Your sales will go through the roof. It was an amazing city, but I didn't know much about it. And I was following the Lonely Planet, I think, guidebook, its recommendations on what to do. So one day we went to the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum. Now, if you're like me, your world history class in high school kind of made it to about, I don't know, World War I before the AP exam. And then after that, everything's a write-off because nobody cares after the exam, right? So Ho Chi Minh, I was a blank slate, didn't know a thing. So we go there, go to the mausoleum, stand in this long line and walk our way through these beautiful gardens, get to the building itself, which is kind of this austere building, go through a long hallway, turn a corner, and there are these sort of amber lighting, very dim lighting. I thought, what is this? And we come around the bend, and there in the middle of this room in a big glass case is the body of Ho Chi Minh, dressed in his uniform, and it was a very bizarre, sort of somber experience, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Every year or so, his body is flown to Russia for more embalming and then comes back, and I just started to think about this, because when you're a preacher, your vacations are about sermon illustrations. You wondered why preachers are always on vacation? This is why. Sermon illustrations. So I started to think, what would it be like in our country to go to the grave, say, of one of our founding fathers, one of our ideological leaders, and go to the grave and say you could actually look inside the grave and see the bones there, or in this case, see the whole body there. What would that be like, and how meaningful would that be for us? And I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, if I could go to Thomas Jefferson's grave and open up the casket or whatever and see his bones, I would probably think, wow, I owe sort of a lot to this guy. In many ways, with his pen, he framed out some of the ideologies of our nation. And I understand more about where we have come from thanks to this guy. But seeing his bones or seeing his body gives me no sense of security or surety for the future. Going to the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial tells me absolutely nothing about the future of this country, does it? It says where we come from. It says nothing about the future. Well, every week on Sundays, people across the globe get together and they have mini Easter services. Christians, Central people, that's what we actually do every Sunday, even though we don't call it Easter, it's like mini Easter. We are celebrating the fact that our leader is not in a grave. You can't go to his tomb and see his body there, and the difference that makes has to do with the future. The fact that we can't go see Jesus' bones means we have a sure hope for the future. I think that's what it boils down to. We're going to look at that this morning briefly from a text in these red Bibles. If you want to pull out the Bible, it should be under the chair in front of you. Make sure you don't grab the jacket of whoever's sitting in front of you. That gets awkward. We'll be on page 910. You could also look it up on your phone, Matthew chapter 28. We're going to look at the first 15 verses. I'll pray, and then we'll jump into it. Praying, by the way, is one of the implications of believing that Jesus is alive, that he's not in the tomb. I think he hears our prayers, he answers our prayers. If you're not there, if you don't believe that, that's fine. I'm not asking you to check your brain at the door or anything like that. Just, you can listen for a moment. Jesus, I believe that by your Spirit you inspired these words to be written thousands of years ago and in a specific historical circumstance, detailing specific historical events. I pray that you would cause these words to sink into our hearts, that you'd help us to understand them accurately. Help us to see truth. If it means changing our minds about things, I pray that you would enable us to do that. If it means changing our lives in certain ways, I pray that you would enable us to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, let me read this. This is the account, at least Matthew's version of the account of finding that Jesus is not in the tomb. Chapter 28. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for the angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook like the ground had just shaken and became like dead men. They're guarding a corpse, or they think they are. It's kind of beautiful irony. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I've told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, understandably, who wouldn't be, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings." I mean, that is the most understated thing ever. "Hey, back from the grave." They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." While the women were on the way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we'll satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among, should probably say, the Judeans, the people kind of in the immediate vicinity of Jerusalem, to this very day. Many of you here would consider yourselves Christians, followers of Christ, and many of you wouldn't. I want to speak specifically to those of you who consider yourselves Christians just for a moment. The rest of you can listen in. Christians, what we believe is weird. Weird. Totally strange. You need to hear that. I think it's really important for us to have this reality check every once in a while, that we believe that Jesus, who was alive and then was dead and then came back to life, never to die again, we have to hear that is strange to believe in. All right? Reality check. I'm naturally, I think, a pretty sort of skeptical guy. Jill told me several months ago that she was pregnant. I was like, really? Really? What's the evidence? So she showed me, the little deal. And I was like, well, how accurate are those things? Get out the box, and it's like 99 point. And I was like, well, it's a multi-pack. Let's do some more. Like 9 pregnancy tests later, we were afraid and filled with great joy. I'm naturally a skeptical guy. I don't think of myself as particularly credulous, but I think there is, in this circumstance, reason to believe that something terribly unusual has happened. Let's look at that very quickly. Why is this maybe a reasonable thing to believe? The first thing is eyewitness testimony. Okay? Matthew records that these two women, Mary and Mary, go to the tomb, and they had been there when Jesus' body was put in the tomb. And they come back a few days later, and the tomb has been sealed, and there's this phalanx of probably Jewish temple guards, highly trained, guarding it, and the body is not there. All 4 of the primary biographers of Jesus record this sort of eyewitness testimony. In fact, one of them, in a sequel to his biography of Jesus, talks about the fact that Jesus, after he came back to life, appeared to more than 500 people in the city. And they give names, not of all 500, but they give names. Okay, why is that important? Well, if you are a normal person who finds it hard to believe that a body that was dead has come back to life, you sort of follow up on these sorts of details, right? You fact check, you bust out Wikipedia or whatever. And if these followers of Jesus have purported that he has appeared to 500 people and there are names, you go and check that out. You ask some of the people who have seen Jesus after he's come back to life. And if they haven't, if this is just a fabrication, then it's pretty easy to dismiss this story. It's pretty easy to dismantle it. I think one of the fascinating things, particularly about Matthew's telling of it, and some of the other gospel writers as well, is that the first people who discovered that Jesus was alive again, and the first people to whom he appeared were women. It's awesome. I love it, because it's totally in line with the way Jesus treated women during his life. He was very respectful of them, honored them as bearers of the image of God, and then he shows up to these women first. He was very countercultural, and actually that's important because in the first century, if you were just fabricating this story that Jesus had come back to life, if you want people to believe your story, you're not going to have women being the first eyewitnesses. You're going to have a guy, and it's probably going to be a guy who's got some sort of credible social status. He's a civic leader or something. That's who you have be your primary witness. But the gospel writers, they're trying to tell it like it was. Like Jesus showed up to these women first, and after that he showed up to a bunch of dudes, and then 500 other people. Okay? There were eyewitnesses. Here's another thing that's important. These eyewitnesses go from being followers of Jesus to being worshipers. You notice that? He comes back and he's like, greetings. And they fall at his feet and they worship him. Okay, Jesus during his lifetime was in many ways similar to what would have been a rabbi in the first century, a kind of wandering teacher. And the wandering teachers would gather disciples who would learn from and revere and respect their leader, but you didn't typically worship your rabbi. Something happens very unique when Jesus comes back to life, when he's raised from the dead. All of a sudden his followers start worshiping him. They're no longer like, hey, we're going to follow you and learn from you. They're like, we will go wherever you want us to go, even to death. We will learn anything you will possibly teach us, and we will worship you. In fact, they changed their day of worship from Saturday, the Sabbath, to Sunday, the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. They start worshiping this guy because they believed so deeply in the fact that something completely unusual had happened here. He wasn't just a normal guy who dies. He died and was raised back to life. Okay, one more thing that I think is interesting. You noticed that the guards then go back and they confer with the religious leaders, and they concoct this phony story, a cover-up plan, and they decide that they're going to, bribe the governor if it comes to that. Well, here's the thing. The two most powerful groups of people in Jerusalem in the first century are the kind of civic leaders who are an extension of the power of Caesar in Rome. You've got Pilate, the governor, and his officials. And you have the religious leaders who also have some civic responsibilities, but people like the chief priests, the temple officers. Okay, those are the two most powerful groups, and rarely do they agree, but on this occasion, they are on the same page because Jesus is a threat to both parties. And Jesus, who dies and then comes back to life, is a big threat to both parties. Okay? If they don't want this story circulated, all of the resources of both of these two powerful groups are there to dismantle this story. All you have to do, if he hasn't been raised, is go to the tomb, pull out the body, parade it through the streets. He's dead. Story quashed. Or if his disciples did steal the body and take it somewhere else, you've got police and army officers and the resources of Rome and the temple to go track down where this body is and punish the disciples and find the body and parade it. You can put this story down if there is a body to produce. A century later, in the second century, a writer named Justin tells us that this story, that the body was stolen but never found, is still being circulated. Would have been a very easy story to put down if there were a body to produce. All right, let's step away from the historical stuff for just a moment. This, I think, also is another reason to take this seriously. If you'll indulge me, my personal experience. I think Jesus was raised from the dead in part because I think I have a relationship with him now. At least that's the way I understand it. I believe I talk to him. I believe he talks to me in a sense. I believe he intervenes in my life. And that's the way I've understood it since I was a kid and began what I understood as a relationship with him. And that's been the experience of many friends of mine and family of mine. Even just this last week, I was on the Beltway, 695, coming back towards Towson, and there was a situation at work that I was praying about. I was like, God, I really need your help here. There's this thing, I've been trying to work it out and trying to work it out and trying to work it out, and nothing's happening. And Jesus, I need you to step in and fix it or show me I'm going in the wrong direction. Like 10:15, I get a phone call. I was like, Jesus? No, just kidding. It wasn't Jesus. The phone call was an answer to that prayer. The situation was solved. And you're like, coincidence. Okay, maybe it is. I'm willing to admit that. But that's been my experience over and over again. And that's been the experience of other people I know. You're like, well, maybe you're deluded. I could be, but here's the thing. The way that I have experienced a relationship with what I believe is the risen Jesus is highly continuous. It's very similar to the experience of other people who believe they have a relationship with Jesus in cultures that are radically different from mine. People living on the other side of the planet, and people living 1,500 years ago, and 800 years ago, and 300 years ago in a very different circumstances. And our experiences of Jesus are quite similar. We could be making this up. We could be deluded. But if it is just a delusion, it's a delusion occurring on a scale that is absolutely without peer in the world of sort of psychocultural phenomena. So if you came as a guest today with friends or family and you're not sure about this, ask them at lunch, in the car rides. Go, look, what's been your experience of this guy Jesus? Is he alive? Does it seem like he's alive in your life? They should tell you. If you just kind of came on your own, again, you're my hero. Come talk to me, or come talk to one of the prayer ministers afterwards, or talk to the people who are singing and playing up here. They'll tell you about their experience of the risen Jesus. Okay. Those are some of the reasons why I think it's kind of reasonable to believe this crazy thing happened. Okay. What does it mean? Why is it important? Well, the first thing is that if Jesus was raised from the dead, then death has been defeated. Like, really? I have friends and family members who have died, and it's still painful. And they're gone, and they haven't come back. Well, God's spokespeople in the Old Testament, the prophets, when they talked about resurrection, the way they talked about resurrection was always God's people coming back to life together en masse, not just one individual. And the way Jesus' followers, after he's come back to life, understand it is that he is the first person to come back to life, never to die again, but he's not going to be the only one. That in his resurrection, the power of death has been broken. And so one day, everybody will be raised back to life. And you're like, what difference does that make? Huge difference. I'm a preacher. I spend a lot of time presiding over funerals and going to funerals. And funerals are hard. But I have something much better to say than he's going to live on in your memories. I can say, you're going to see him again. Your loved one, if they died believing in Jesus, they're coming back to life. Your last experience of them is not going to be loss. I mean, that's a reason for hope. That's huge. And it's not this kind of disembodied resurrection where we're going to be like see-through angels floating on clouds, strumming harps. It's bodies. Notice those women grasped Jesus' feet. He had a body. That's great. That's big news. Bodies are awesome when they're functioning well. Think of cheeseburgers. You love bodies. Think of the intimacy of touch of another human. Think of the smell of freshly baked bread. Think of the experience of exerting your body running on a trail in the woods. Bodies are great. And these new bodies that we're going to have, guaranteed by the fact that Christ has a new body, are going to be like Gore-Tex or Teflon when it comes to death and decay. You're just going to shrug it off. In Jesus, the power of death has been broken. Yeah, your body might die, but that is not the end of the story. You're coming back to life. You get a new body that's better than ever. I visit friends of ours in this church family in the hospital whose bodies are failing them. I look in the mirror some days and I see this invasive species of gray hairs creeping in and stealing habitat in my beard from the native brown hairs. Like, we're all getting older, right? And our bodies are letting us down. And we're going to have amazing bodies, resurrection bodies. Jesus' resurrection has guaranteed that. It's the down payment. That is a hope. It's a hope if you have a loved one with chronic illness. It's a hope if you have pain in your physical body. That is hope. Second thing, Jesus' resurrection, I think, for us is proof that our debt to God has been paid in full. Story of the Bible makes it clear that from the beginning of time, there's been this debt that humanity owed to God, because God was perfectly good and humanity was not. And God designed humanity, He made us so that we would function and flourish and flourish when we're in relationship with Him and when we're in good relationship with other human beings and with creation He made. But most of the time we're like, I'd rather do it my own way, thanks. Regardless of how that means we end up treating other people. Regardless of how that means we end up treating God. And that has created this gap between humans and God. It's created a debt where we owe God for our wrongs against other human beings. And we owe God for our wrongs against Him. And the way this was dealt with in the Old Testament was sort of provisionally. Animals would be the substitutes for humans. They would be sacrificed so the debt could be paid temporarily. So that humans could have a relationship with the God who made them. But when Jesus died on that cross, He celebrated on Good Friday, and came back to life, very quickly His followers began to understand that His death was the new substitute. No more animals needed. His perfect life had been offered to pay that debt. But if He just dies and then is in the grave, it's like, really? Did that work? Any of you guys use TurboTax? I've used TurboTax for the last several years. It's a source of great anxiety in my life. And you know, when you get to the end of that, and it gives you the option to file electronically, and there's this button that says submit or file electronically, and it's a big green button, and I'm always like sweating it when I press that button. I press it, click, and it goes in. I'm still sort of anxious, right? For a day, 2 days, 3 days, until you get this email back. I think you guys have done this. Am I the only one? Have I fallen for a scam? You get this email back that says the federal government has accepted your tax return. It's like, whew. Apostle Paul says, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, then you are still in your sin. The implication is, if He has been raised from the dead, then God has said the debt is paid in full. The check did not bounce. Hallelujah. That's a reason for hope. That means you can have a relationship without guilt, without shame, with the God who made you, who created you good, who loves you, who wants a relationship with you. You can start that now, and it can last forever into your new awesome body. That's a reason for hope. Third thing. Resurrection of Jesus was never meant to be the whole story. It's just the beginning. I talked a moment ago about how resurrection of one person in the Old Testament was always connected to the resurrection of others. But it was always just the resurrection of bodies was always just a piece of the package. It was always like a bundled deal. It was bundled in with this whole refurb project that God was going to do, where He was going to restore things, when He was going to put things back to rights, when He was going to right injustices, where He was going to take care of mean oppressors and He was going to lift up the oppressed. Anybody from Botswana here? Anybody from Pennsylvania? Okay, welcome, Pennsylvanians. You're not as relevant as Botswanans to this story, but glad you're here. In Botswana, not in Pennsylvania, in Botswana, there's this enormous desert called the Kalahari. Some of you probably know this. And there's a river called the Okavango River that flows from the mountains of Angola to the north, down across the border, into the middle of this Kalahari Desert in Botswana. And it never makes it to the ocean. It just kind of fans out. And every summer there, it's southern hemisphere, so it's like December through February for us, it's blazing hot. And the desert just gets scorched, and any greenery dries up. And the ground gets hard and cracked and inhospitable, and all the animals have to leave the area because it just can't sustain life. And while it's still blazing hot out, rain starts to fall on the mountains in Angola. And that rain starts to make its way down the Okavango River. It takes usually 2 or 3 months before it gets to the Kalahari Desert, and nobody knows exactly which day it's going to arrive. You get these wattled cranes. They're like the first animals to know the water is coming, and they show up. They flock to the area. I call them John the Baptist birds, but that's just kind of a weird Bible joke. But they show up first, and then you get this water that trickles down through this riverbed into the middle of this Kalahari Desert. And the animals that have managed to survive there for a little while and are desperately thirsty rush to that water, and they slake their thirst. Whew. But if you know how this happens every year, you know that's just the beginning. That first trickle of water is just the front edge, and it's going to be followed by more water and more water that just gradually flows in, and it flows around the anthills, and it flows all out into this delta, and the animals get satisfied, and then the ground starts to soak in this life-giving water, and then these plants that are all dried and shriveled start to become green again as they soak the water up, and these shrubs put out leaves, and birds start flocking back to the area and hanging out in these trees. And the animals come now from miles away, not only because they can drink, but now because the grass is lush and green, and it's gone from being this inhospitable, deadly desert to being an Eden again. That's what it's like with the resurrection. Jesus' resurrection was the front edge of God's refurb project. He's not done. He's not done. He's going to fix things. Your work to be a force for good in individual lives, your individual decisions to make a difference, they're not wasted. Even if you don't see the fruit of them, they're part of a project that is going to succeed, and God is going to complete the refurb project. Jesus' resurrection was the front edge of that. That's good news. That is a hope for the future. Even if your week looks pretty bleak, even if you're living in a part of the world where things are pretty rough, even if your family situation is pretty desperate, God is going to put it to rights in the end, and Jesus' resurrection is the front edge of that. If you are a Christian here, Jesus' resurrection is the guarantee of our hope in all of these ways and so many others. Most weeks we give you a challenge, like go out this week and do this. This week your challenge is party. We're going to get the band back up here in a moment, and I just want you guys to feel the weight of what he's done. Live into this guarantee, celebrate it. And if you aren't yet there, if you're not a Christian, hey, you're welcome to the party. Come, listen in. Think about